Bueno, hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida al... Ay, sí está... Ah, es que yo no... Perdón. Estaba en el canal de traducción. Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida al CIEL de agosto, en el que está la doctora María Paula y el doctor Gerald Campano. Para hablar de los métodos de investigación basados en la comunidad. La doctora María Paula Ghiso está en el Teachers College de Columbia University, ¿no? Y es una gran amiga de Letras para Volar, del Instituto Transdisciplinar en Literacidad y de la maestría en Literacidad. Y su doctorado es en Reading, Writing and Literacy en la Universidad de Pensilvania. Sí, estoy bien. Y bueno, y el doctor Gerald Campano también es un gran amigo de Letras para Volar, del Instituto Transdisciplinar en Literacidad y ahora también de la maestría en Estudios en Literacidad. Y bueno, él también es profesor en literatura, cultura y educación internacional de la Graduate School en la Universidad de Pensilvania, ¿no? Y bueno, ya sin más preámbulo, les voy a hacer la palabra porque aparte de su conferencia nos van a enseñar otros productos audiovisuales y para no continuarlo alargando un poco más. Bueno, muchas gracias y bienvenidos a Paula y a Gerald. Es un gusto que estén con nosotros.
Muchas gracias y un gusto estar con todos ustedes y compartir nuestro trabajo y también tener la oportunidad de dialogar. Quiero empezar dándole las gracias a todo el equipo de Itrali y a la doctora Pati Rosas, a Mayra, a Natalie, todo el equipo por ahí, también a Coco Martínez por su traducción. Vamos a dar en inglés la conferencia, pero gracias Coco por estar aquí. Okay. Entonces voy a compartir pantalla para mostrarle algunas de los datos que vamos a compartir hoy. So thank you. It is my pleasure to be here. And today we're going to be talking about community-based research methods. So I'll turn it over to Gerald to share and get us started.
Wonderful. It's really fantastic to see everyone. Thank you. We have a little bit of an echo. Oh, that's my mute. Oh, sorry. Okay, can everyone still hear me?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. It's much better, yeah.
No, okay, go. Now go.
And so we're going to do a presentation today. We're going to read part of it, talk through part of it, even show a little bit of a film. But at heart, what we're arguing for is a variety of participatory research, which involves really long-term collaboration with communities, including families, youth, elders, community leaders, and educators. And in the process of making an argument for this kind of research, what we call community-based research and education, we're going to engage in some critique. We're going to critique extractivist epistemologies, which are very common in research, including in the field of education. And our North Star is going to be a methodology of research that we're conceiving of as a practice of love. And at the end of the presentation, I know this sounds a little sentimental when we invoke love and what it means to think about research methodology as love. But hopefully, as we go through our work together, we'll be able to kind of talk with more specificity about what that means. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a narrative from the spring of 2022, when two youths who are in our project, Jasmine and Owen, presented at a Zoom event meant to address intersectional issues of education and housing justice. In addition to the young people, The speakers included residents of an affordable housing complex adjacent to the university, which was being targeted for demolition, community activists, and university faculty and students. It was genuinely a polyphonic literacy event in the Bakhtinian sense, bringing together voices and expertise from various social and institutional locations, which, in concert, disrupted the seeming inevitability of deeply entrenched inequities that impact local families. It was also one small action in a whole constellation of events that grew out of the larger movement for Black lives in the city of Philadelphia and its rich and ongoing activist and organizing legacies. The organizers of the panel highlighted the demands of the community organizers, that the university, my own institution, the University of Pennsylvania, intervened to protect the affordable housing complex, one of the last vestiges of the working class Black community contiguous to campus after an oppressive history of gentrification, and that the university and other affluent nonprofits make something called payments in lieu of taxes, or pilots, to the city school district, which is severely underfunded. Philadelphia, where we are from, is the most impoverished large city in all of the United States. And this is absolutely reflected in its schools, which don't have adequate school counselors, have overcrowded classrooms, have very toxic buildings imbued with asbestos and lead, for example. And a big source of funding for the public school system is the local taxes. But because the University of Pennsylvania is a nonprofit university, it is exempt from paying taxes. So the community activists are demanding that Penn and other affluent nonprofits pay some of what they would otherwise pay in taxes to this impoverished school system. In support of pilots, Owen and Jasmine presented their original research on the material conditions of learning in the city school district, including the toxic buildings, which had led to yet another round of school shutterings in the city. They also shared their findings on the unconscionable counselor to student ratios, the lack of school nurses, the tracking system, and the need to shift resources there in the education system and society writ large. All the speakers drew parallels between housing and education injustices, both of which involve the dispossession and displacement of predominantly Black, brown, and immigrant families. They pooled their respective expertise to gain a deeper understanding of the inequalities of our city and, in the process, prefigured new social arrangements premised on collective liberation.
And just checking, you hear me okay? You hear us okay? Great, perfect, thank you. I couldn't see the chat when I'm sharing the screen, so I just wanted to make sure, since I saw somebody connecting. So this is the event that Gerald was talking about. If you turn back the clock to about a decade earlier, to the beginning of the initiative, it would have been hard to imagine Owen and Jasmine, who were then 8 and 7 years old, respectively, presenting original research to an audience of close to 200 local activists and university faculty and students. Presentations which were, by all accounts, informative, persuasive, and poignant. As young children, their first activity in our partnership, which you can see pictured here, was a pen pal exchange with master's students from Gerald's literacy course and the parish's Indonesian community Sunday school, where they honed their writing skills and the university students could examine examples of emergent literacy. This idea of the letter exchange was initiated and organized by Jasmine's mother, an incredible neighborhood and parish leader. Although we were not engaging in official research yet at this point, We were in the process of developing a trusting and reciprocally beneficial relationship between the university team and families from the South Philadelphia immigrant community. We were laying the foundation for a long-term partnership. In retrospect, therefore, Jasmine and Owen's scholarly community engagement is not surprising. Over the past decade, with the support of graduate students and elders, they have been conducting original research on topics that impact them and their communities, including immigration rights, healthcare, environmental justice, civic engagement, and educational access. They have attended numerous scholarly conferences and have even published in academic journals, including several important venues dedicated to the work of youth researchers. These experiences have helped them demystify academia, but also, because of the culturally relevant nature of the research, make academia their own, a means through which they can deepen their understandings of themselves and their relationship to the world. Since fall of 2010, we have cultivated this shared research partnership, which we call the CARE initiative, the Communities Advancing Research and Education, in which university-based researchers and youth, families, and community leaders from South Philadelphia investigate and take action on a range of educational issues. And we'll share with you some of those examples later in the presentation. Members of the partnership have been working together to research schooling injustices, especially as they impact communities of color and from immigrant backgrounds, to create alternative spaces for students to engage in culturally responsive and critical inquiries, and to advocate for educational change in local contexts and beyond. Since its inception, the partnership has been intergenerational and coalitional, with members coming together across linguistic, cultural, racial, and institutional boundaries to understand issues impacting their educational experiences, and to forge networks with local activist organizations to learn from and build on community resistance. As we mentioned, and is the topic of this talk, the partnership is grounded in community-based research methods. And community-based research challenges the hierarchies of university collaborations by shifting who is thought of as a researcher, drawing attention to issues of power and ethics, and foregrounding how those who have often been positioned as the objects of educational interventions can and have the right to play an active role in advancing more just educational arrangements.
So we just wanted to share a little bit about how this research originated. Kind of conventionally, a lot of research originates where university researchers and scholars kind of come up with a question, and then they seek out, for example, a community and a context within which to explore that question. But it worked a little different for our project, and I would say somewhat organically. Maria, Paula, and I used to live in Philadelphia, then we left, and then we came back here. And when we came back, we wanted to get a sense of the activist landscape of the city, including, for example, around issues of immigrant rights. So one of the things we decided to do was to learn directly from a lot of grassroots immigrant rights organizations, including, and these are just the names of the organizations in Philadelphia at the time. Juntos, there's a Cambodian immigrant rights group called One Love, and another immigrant rights movement called the New Sanctuary Movement. There was actually an old sanctuary movement, so this was a new permutation of that. And eventually we attended a Know Your Rights workshop at a church and parish in South Philadelphia. And if you've seen the Rocky movies, it is actually the church where Rocky Balboa got married in Rocky II. We didn't know that at the time, but that's an actual church in South Philadelphia. And at the church, there was a Know Your Rights workshop. So this was for immigrant families, many of whom did not have documentation, who were undocumented, did not have papers. And the workshop was to let them know that if they were confronted by immigration, or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or the police, that they had certain rights. During this presentation, which was predominantly for members of the Indonesian community at the time, there were a lot of powerful testimonials. People were talking about how they were afraid to report crime or even a car accident, because they were afraid that they would get reported to ICE and that they may have their family members or even themselves detained or deported. But after sharing all these difficult testimonies, when leaders from the Indonesian community found out that Maria Paula and I were education professors and also from immigrant backgrounds ourselves, the Indonesian priest and one of the youth leaders came to us and said, we would like to form a partnership, because despite the struggles that our community is going through, education is what gives our community hope. Right? And we found that to be really powerful. And it really speaks to a kind of paradox that so many of us in the field of education in the United States, and I would imagine in Mexico as well, experience. Because on one hand, education can perpetuate inequality and perpetuate social reproduction. There are a lot of injustices in the education system. At the same time, for so many families and so many youth and students, education is still thought of as one vehicle for hope, one vehicle for flourishing, for self-determination, and to have more life opportunities. So that's one of the things we all struggle with in the field of education, is how can we make education a vehicle for hope and not a mechanism of social reproduction.
And so as Gerald shared, the partnership began directly with the parish. And although we are deeply conflicted, garden variety, social justice Catholics, we didn't partner with the parish for religious reasons. But if you want to know and work alongside families, including immigrant families, faith-based organizations are potentially a promising way to go. So we went where communities that we were interested in partnering with were and followed their leads, rather than kind of finding a site and importing our research into the site. Our primary partners, though, were the families directly, including members from the Indonesian community, the concerned Black Catholic community, the Latinx, predominantly Mexican community, and others, including individuals from the Vietnamese community and the Filipino community. We spent the first several years supporting the communities on issues that matter to them, organizing, for example, a family literacy night and a health night before we engaged in any participatory or collaborative research.
Wonderful. So before we really began research, we realized that it was very important for us to be explicit about the professional and ethical norms which guide our work. And, we created these norms a while ago, and we published an article about them in 2015. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that these norms really function to challenge, what we're calling extractivist epistemologies in research. And extractivist epistemologies really means looking at the people with whom you partner, the people who are the participants in your research, as resources, as objects to be theorized, right? Rather than theorizers themselves. And if over the years we've had one issue that so many of the families we've worked alongside have shared with us, is when they have felt really kind of betrayed when researchers from universities, or even others, when people who work in nonprofit organizations, et cetera, just kind of come into the community, gather data, and just leave, right? And so these norms that we have here are really meant to challenge that. So the first norm is equality is the starting point, not the end point. And what we mean by that is really kind of a conception that all people are intellectuals. All people are theorists. All people are creators, irrespective of different aspects of their ascribed identities. So, for example, a community member may not have much formal education, but that does not in any way compromise their ability to kind of theorize and research and investigate their experiences. Related to that is that community members' knowledge and perspectives must be taken seriously. That often people, for example, who are directly impacted by oppression have epistemic privilege, are in a unique position to inquire into and examine these dynamics of inequality. It also requires, I think, for those of us who are affiliated with universities or who are educators, it requires a certain relational epistemic humility. That, so much, for example, so many universities, like my own university, is a little bit arrogant. It claims to have a monopoly on knowledge production. But rather, when working very closely and in partnership with families and communities, we really need the humility to learn from others who are most directly impacted by these larger forces of inequality. Methodologically, it also entails that the research foci and questions are co-designed with the community members in mind. And the fourth one, really important, is that no matter what we do, what kind of research we do, together or as part of this larger project, that we have to make a case that our research should benefit the community. And finally, I think the last one really speaks to a notion of epistemic pluralism, that there are multiple ways of knowing and engaging the world. And that is that the research is made public in transparent, collaborative, and creative ways. So we, in fact, have written a lot of scholarly articles, including alongside, for example, a number of youth in our project. But we've also gone public with our research in other ways. For example, in this documentary, which we'll share at different kind of academic conferences, but also at events that really speak directly to the school district and the community. And in all these ways, we're trying to kind of shift the paradigm of research, right? And shift the idea that knowledge is kind of solely manufactured in academia and in universities and then transmitted to communities, but actually that communities, schools, and universities can work in really productive relationships and partnerships together to generate knowledge about our shared world and to honor the various forms of knowledge and expertise that all participants bring to the table.
And so these norms have resulted in a number of research inquiries throughout the year, and I'll share just a little bit about them, but they are broad because they're really following community priorities and interests. So, for example, we designed and implemented an after-school comics club for elementary age children. We worked in context of English as a second language courses when families and youth were interested in understanding language access and gaining language access. Research groups around college access, around high school access, around equity and partnerships, and around civic engagement, around issues that intersect with education, such as housing justice, which is what Gerald was talking about, and we'll share a little bit. Hold on a second. Something happened here. Sorry, my screen wasn't working. So this is, for example, some artwork that Jasmine, who we've been featuring in the presentation, and who has been a research fellow with us for this year and the coming years. This is some work that she did exploring issues of personal identity through the arts, through photography. And here she talked about intersectional identities as having immigrant backgrounds. Youth also explored coalitional inquiries. So for example, how to be in solidarity against anti-Asian violence and against anti-Black racism. So thinking about, since our group is itself very diverse, what are the particular issues that different communities are facing? And then what are some of the intersections across those experiences, and how can we work together in solidarity with one another to support everyone's flourishing? We've also, as you know, we're literacy scholars and we don't believe in literacy as just text, although we love books and we love poetry and writing, but we also think about the arts as a text and a way of communicating and making meaning of the world. And so we have engaged with broader artistic texts happening in the city. This is from a mural by Michelle Angela Ortiz, who works around immigration justice. It's called Flores de Libertad. And it used Mexican paper flowers with community messages to support awareness of issues of deportation and detention of families of immigrant origin and undocumented status in the city. And so our youth and families, many of whom were participants in this activist organization, as well as in our own partnership, engaged with similar artistic methods to explore these issues together. And so here in this next example, as you see some of the youth's art as they talked about these issues and made them their own, and also talked about unity and the ways that these issues impacted many communities in the city.
Great. We also wanted to just share an example of collective research that we did with our families, that really was premised on a strength-based perspective. So again, instead of we as university-based researchers collecting data and then bringing it back to the university and analyzing it, we tried to be really imaginative of how we can think about data collection and data interpretation in a different way, as something that's very collaborative, as something that's very horizontal, that really involves everyone in our larger research community, youth, children, elders, and adults alike. So one of the things we did is the families decided that we were, and these are families from the different cultural and linguistic groups that we worked with. So families from the Indonesian community, families from the Mexican community, families from the Black community, families from the Vietnamese community. What we decided is everyone would bring in an artifact that reflects, number one, the ways in which they are already supporting their children's education. And that's really important because there's a lot of deficit discourse about families, about what they don't do, rather than what families do to support their children. Then they also brought in an artifact to reflect a challenge that they're experiencing in the school system. And finally, they brought in or created an artifact reflecting what their dreams for their children's futures would be with respect to schooling and with respect to education. And all the families shared their different artifacts, and together in groups, we looked at them and we coded or analyzed all the artifacts. And after we analyzed them, we came up with different themes that the families translated into different demands that they believed that their children deserved for the education system. So what you have here are the demands that the families came up with in their own original research. For example, that all students have access to the same academic opportunities, that more teachers, and that there are more teachers and supports for children, for example, across abilities or children who are struggling with disabilities, that all teachers get training to address racism and honor diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of one powerful example of how their research kind of came into fruition through this set of demands which they ended up calling Education Without Boundaries. We are all human.
And so we wanted to share a little bit, in addition to the content of the research that families and youth are doing in partnership with us, we're also interested in the process of partnering and how is it that we can create the conditions for collaborative inquiry. And so one of the challenges has been navigating the multiple languages and the multiple perspectives that families and youth bring, which we believe is unequivocally a strength of the partnership, right? And so part of it has been developing practices, pedagogical practices in our own research as a partnership that allow everyone's knowledge and perspectives to be made visible, to be heard, and to be honored, right? And so, for example, one of the challenges has been the language differences among different cultural communities. And over time, our joint practices have really evolved to address this and has displaced monolingualism as the norm. So in our meetings, bilingual individuals take it upon themselves to translate for one another, whether they're having translating in whole group discussions or inside conversations or conducting small group breakouts by language. And at the same time, everyone's very used to the fact that they're not going to understand everything that's heard, that we all need to become comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. And we are also mindful that these types of meetings take a longer time because we need to make space for things to be translated. And people really do wait patiently as ideas are translated and shared with the entire group. This idea is really a little bit in tension with the efficiency and productivity of academic timelines and traditional research methods. But by decoupling linguistic proficiency from intellectual contributions in our everyday ways of engaging with one another, these moment-to-moment interactions prefigure the types of horizontal relationships that are central to community-based research and education. And they create opportunities for other kinds of collaborative designs in the service of educational change. And here you have a little bit of a discussion by one of our youth, Jasmine, who is talking about how the arts are used in meetings, family meetings, to surface and think with one another's perspectives. So she talked about when we have family meetings, having different types of arts and crafts that even if you can't understand another person, you can draw together. It doesn't stop you from doing that, right? And you engaging together in these, what we would think about these literacies, right? These artistic literacies, you can work together. And it says, she talks about the art speaks for itself.
And here is just one other example, which is pretty hot off the press. Remembering now that our partnership with the communities now has gone on, it's been over a decade. So we've been working with the families, a core group of around 50 or 60 individuals for over a decade, for roughly 12 or 13 years. And most recently, some of our youth have become very involved in researching the issue of gentrification. And one of the struggles that they've become very involved in is in Chinatown. Chinatown is really a locus of the community, where so many immigrant families come and find community and really find security as they adjust, to the United States. But recently, the city is trying to build a sports arena for the basketball team, the 76ers, in the heart of Chinatown. And that, if that were to happen, that would really kind of like rip apart the community. So a lot of our youth, and on the left, we have one of our doctoral students, Claire One, and Jasmine, who we decided to feature in it, have been very involved in the struggle. And they've been doing research on Chinatown and its historic struggle to preserve itself, because this isn't the first time that Chinatown has been in threat. You know, decades ago, for example, they were attempting to build an interstate highway through Chinatown. So our young people have done all this research on the neighborhood and on the community and issues of gentrification and dispossession, especially because Chinatown remains one of the last working class communities of color in the heart of Philadelphia. I think another thing that's really powerful is a number of our youth from the Indonesian community have been involved in this kind of like activist knowledge generation. But if we again turn back the clock to 10 years ago, a number of our youth and families would have been very hesitant to be involved in something like this. And for good reason, because they had just left Indonesia, their families on the heels of a genocide, their communities had been targeted, they've been red tagged, and politics was something very scary. And it still is, but over the years, the young people have really learned how to, with the support of others, a lot of grassroots organizations, assert their voice and fight for their rights, you know, in ways that were perhaps unimaginable even a few years ago.
So we want to give you a sense because folks from the partnership were not able to be here at the presentation, to give you a sense in their own words and through their own work of this partnership and what community-based research methods entail. And so Dr. Diasa, who was a graduate student on our partnership and also has been a filmmaker, during his time with the partnership has really worked with the community to create a little documentary that showcases their work. So we're going to take a little time to show this short version of the film that they have all been involved in working on together. And then we'll have some time, we'll just have some conclusions and some times for discussion. And we hope that this gives more of a sense of some of what can't really be captured in just words, right? That is really entailed in community-based research.
Yeah, and just to add, you know, I'm always a little self-conscious about this video because I feel like Maria's great, but I feel like I pontificate a little too much. But we also do have a longer version, which we don't have the time to share today, which is 45 minutes, which really has more of the families and the youth voices. So if you're at all interested in looking at that, just let us know and we can send it to you.
Like in our group and the relationship we've built together over now about 9 years so far have really been the glue that helps fuel and sustain the partnership. And it really has helped move across different boundaries, institutional boundaries that really try to disrupt the hierarchies of power between the university and community contacts, thinking across cultures, across languages. That will be, I think, constitutes good education about how we think things can change, so that we can really work together, work in solidarity to help really transform educational opportunities in our
And committee, we started that. When they asked me to be on the committee, I was honored. And they said, we're honored to have you. I said, well, I'm sitting here with these doctoral students and professors, and they said, we learned a lot from you. So I'm grateful that they're still learning from me.
You didn't come in right away and we're going to do research. We spent the first year or two really working alongside community members, trying to support them initiatives that they wanted to do. A literacy night, supporting them in a health fair, putting them around immigrant rights issues. We just really wanted to take a learning stand. Our goal was never to switch on people, but our goal was to research alongside solidarity. Thomas Aquinas is located in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood that has been historically African-American and Italian-American. Over the decade, the neighborhood has been populated by new communities, new groups, including the Vietnamese community, the Indonesian community, the Latino community, and really many, many others.
I think to me, the most striking feature of that, of what we do, is that it's a real shift away from traditional approaches to research, which in a traditional approach to research, there's a very clear researcher and there's someone or something that's being researched. And historically, there's been a very clear boundary between those two. And that boundary has been reinforced because of unequal power relationships. And so I think that if I were to explain our project to someone for the first time, I would say that we really kind of upend that approach to research, and we took a very collaborative approach to exploring some of the most pressing inequalities in the education system alongside the people who are affected by them the most. And it's really sort of prioritizing the incredible knowledge and experience that people have in pursuing answers to some incredible challenges that are facing minoritized communities all around our city and also beyond it.
Wherever we go, like it's like where our home is, because like versus the last line as well, like we are at home like ourselves. So like where we go, we bring home with us, and it can be like wherever, like the city we're in or the town we're in. And so like that's how it sort of like moves and like sways around.
I'm just surprised that they even know what's the food of our ancestor, because they usually kids just know the food without know the names, but actually they know. Yeah.
The histories and the sacrifices
Yeah.
of their parents. So they're don't get roughly different worlds.
Yeah.
And it also shows that home is love. It doesn't matter. One way is
Yeah.
nurture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Home travels with you, that's it. And home is who I am because I am.
Yeah.
Los domingos con el sonido de mi lengua nativa, cantándole a Jesús. Un hogar donde puedo observar a los niños pequeños con sus sonrisas radiantes, esperando sus turnos para pegarle la piñata. El hogar viaja contigo, nunca solo un lugar. Que el hogar siempre canta a lo lado de familia y amigos. El hogar es confortable. El hogar es donde estoy yo, porque estoy en casa.
To me, what's special about the group is that we can share and have these kinds of conversations that sometimes we're having each other as parents, or I remember having with my friends as kids being in immigrant here. But here we can have these conversations that sometimes they don't happen in the day-to-day life. So thank you all for sharing so much and for the beautiful poem that you gave us, and I think now the world can benefit from.
que lidiar con muchos obstáculos solo por nuestro color de piel. Nos atacan con más bullying, racismo y criminalización. Todos los días sufriendo traumas psicológicos. Con esta administración que tenemos, somos más vulnerables, somos más atacados en la escuela. Los estudiantes no dan el mismo rendimiento estudiantil, porque hay miedo y temor de que cuando regresemos a casa no veamos a nuestros padres, porque pueden ser detenidos solo por tener rasgos físicos. Muchas veces tenemos que hacer marchas, protestas y desobediencias civiles innecesarias para hacer entender que merecemos respeto, que merecemos un trato justo, que no somos criminales, que no somos ilegales, que somos seres humanos. De igual manera, como padres, dando hasta la vida por nuestros hijos. Todos los días salir a trabajar y no saber si regresaremos a darles ese beso, ese abrazo, ese te quiero a nuestros hijos. Todos los días vivir así, en un país a donde es nuestro hogar. Así es la vida de 11 millones de indocumentados, que esto no perjudica la educación. Todos debemos tener la libertad de estar y ser libres. Todos debemos tener lo que por derecho nos corresponde, sin importar el color de piel, estatus, condición social o género. Tenemos esperanza de que todo cambie a mejor, de que los maestros tengan más comunicación con los estudiantes y los padres, porque somos seres humanos y vivimos en el mismo mundo. Y si los niños son el futuro, nosotros como padres nos corresponde dejar un hogar en paz y tranquilo. Un mundo mejor sin injusticias y violaciones a los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
I'm from Indonesia, so we have a different how to solve the problem, different methods how to solve the problem. And the teacher cannot accept it and cannot value our knowledge about that, even though the end of the result or the answer of the problem is sick.
These researchers have become involved in action research that intends to make a difference in the lives of their co-researchers and those who will enter the St. Aquinas community, perhaps when they are no longer there. Debbie opened up about talking about academic support for students. As natives of Indonesia, they sought to understand more about the writing and reading supports needed for their students. She shared the linguistic struggles that parents and children have, and some of the items those of us who are native speakers of English take for granted, like filling out forms to make sure that our children get the things that they need. Also talked about understanding and paying attention to the everyday realities of working, living, surviving, while holding the highest hopes in education for future opportunities. Just as so many people have before, just as all of us in this room understand the importance of education in futures and part of our training. Myth-busting stereotypes about Black and Asian kids. Embracing difference, exposing the tracking system in their schools, and choosing to uncover the similarities that make them human and allow for friendship. I've heard the language of dreams, the language of hope, the language of resistance. I'm about to cry. Resistance. Estimate of budget cuts to their school. The young people took up the question, how can we really support the whole child if we don't invest in them in the ways that they deserve? The youth shared how they combated these budget cuts by taking the issue into their own hands, applying for grants, conducting bake sales, various selling activities and school events that were intended to raise money. And in such an important way, I finally walked in, circled around into a parent talking about how money is spent for increased security in schools, officers, cameras, metal detectors. And she rejected the idea that we have become a society that would want teachers to be armed with guns. Become out of control and not about the learning that is supposed to happen. In both English and in her mother tongue of Spanish, she talked about how students are not getting the education that they deserve, how students are being labeled as bad, being labeled as criminal, and that this is a daily occurrence. She talked about how students are separated, the good over here, the bad over there, when there are all students who are deserving of an equitable education. And then finally, we learned about the unsanitary conditions in some schools and how this interrupts their learning during the day. And so they left me with the question that through the power of their work, a question that I beg all of you to continue to ask. What have our students become? And how can we make our schools be the places that they need to be?
All the children that have been in the AIR group have graduated or have been to college. To give them a sense that they belong somewhere, they can come, they can be honest. You know, like the kids were having problems in school when we first started. And now you have a new group who's going through almost the same thing. You know, having problems, language barriers. It never stops. And it's good that they have a place to come to.
You can't advocate, you can't research unless you know and care for one another, unless you build relationships, unless you foster an ethos of care. That really sets the foundation for us to then engage in critical work.
What we discovered when we were researching the practice of partnering, at the heart, you know, what really kind of sustains the work and keeps it going is congregation. It's people coming together, discussing, working out their differences. But more important than working out their differences or working out conflict is really knowing that we love and care for one another. And I know that this sounds sentimental, but I have heard more people talking about love in research, and I think that's a really important shift from when I was a student. But I think it's also important to clarify what we mean by love, because people can do a lot of terrible things in the name of love. And I think there's a corruption of love when love is based on a unitary or homogenous identity that excludes others. I think the love that we're talking about is a love based on radical hospitality, a sense of shared precarity, a sense of human and not even non-human interdependence. It's really a love that embraces multiplicity, a love that embraces difference. And I want to say, even at a fundamental level, even the multiplicity and difference within ourselves, that this is a type of research that requires a lot of personal hard work, coming to terms both about the ways in which so many people working on the project have been targets and have been victims of histories of oppression, but also the ways in which we've been complicit in these histories. And really knowing oneself and taking the opportunity to learn from others in order to expand all of our own epistemic horizons. In order to do that, you know, love has to be at the center. And again, I return to Audre Lorde's ideal of the interdependence of non-dominant differences and creating that interdependence, valuing difference, but valuing it in a way that doesn't perpetuate domination, of course, is a never-ending task. But at the heart of it is a more capacious understanding of love.
Okay. I know the. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Now.
Wonderful. I know the video, at least on our end, was a little choppy, but we hope that gave you, I'm gonna need a slide, Maria. We hope that gave you a little bit of a window into the project, right? And one of the things we realized is we're very thankful for Dee to have made this little film, because one of the things it does is it captures really the affective, the emotional dimensions of research, that research is not just about thinking, but research is also very much about feeling, and that thinking and actually feeling are inseparable from one another. So one of the things we believe community-based research does is we believe it promotes or advances, what we're calling epistemic rights, right? Which is kind of like the right to research for everyone, and really ensuring that all people have the support, the time, the resources, the communities to inquire into the inequities of the world, including the education system, and how to make it better. And what we're calling epistemic rights, and we really believe that all, kind of institutions of higher ed that are outward facing, that believe that they're publicly engaged, this can really be central to their missions, to advancing the epistemic rights of all. And these epistemic rights include, but are not limited to, the right to have one's own knowledge interests taken seriously, to be able to participate in multiple collective knowledge projects, both within but also outside academia, to have access to various methodological approaches to research, to be able to be exposed to resources and people that may expand one's own horizons, intellectual horizons, to be able to engage in collective inquiry, and to go public with research to a range of audience. It is the right to know and to construct a knowledge in the service of a more just world. And often people will ask us what the impact of community-based research is. And this is something that we've been thinking about a little bit. And one way we've conceptualized it is through a number of kind of like nested concentric circles. So we believe the research, community-based research, and for example, the CARE initiative that we've been involved in, does impact individuals, right? In very concrete ways. So as was mentioned in the film, just about all the young people, and these are young people that we began working with when they were very young children. Jasmine, for example, was 4 years old when we began working with her. Now she is going to be a senior in high school. But all the young people who have gone through our project have in fact gained access to higher education and have gone to universities and been accepted to universities such as my university, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Pittsburgh, Penn State, Yale University, Princeton University, Swarthmore University, Wesleyan University. And that's something we always said at the beginning of our partnership, is that universities such as the ones that we belong to would be lucky to have these young people as members of their scholarly community. But we want to say that it's not just about access, right? And that we really think about, community-based research as about individual and collective self-determination. So even if a young people didn't choose to go to a university, this is really not what this research is about. It's about the flourishing and survival of communities, both and the individuals in those communities and the communities as a whole. If you look at the next, and just remaining at the individual level, one thing we noticed in the data, which is really powerful, is that the university collective helped individuals reinterpret and re-narrativize their experiences in more empowering ways. So, for example, if a young person internalized a sense of deficit, that there was something wrong with them because they weren't in a college preparation class, for example, or they were tracked at a lower track, the research team would help them understand that the problem wasn't with them. The problem was with the system that had very few college access classes, you know. Or let's say one of the elders in our community felt like a failure because she wasn't living the American dream, right? And was still struggling financially. But the research group helped her understand all the ways in which she was a success and the ways in which she supported future generations and was a very powerful leader in the community. So this idea of, it's almost an idea of hermeneutical justice, that the research team helps individuals have the hermeneutical resources to reinterpret and re-narrativize their experiences in more empowering ways. Another thing that happened at the next level was that a local intellectual commons developed. So people have done research over many, many different years. And we've had, for example, young children do research, and then those young children became middle school students, became high school students, and now in college, and some have even graduated from college. But all the research they've done has benefited future generations in the community. And many of these young people have even come back to be what we call research fellows, partnering with, you know, the faculty and the professors in helping determine the next steps of the research process. So we're never beginning from ground zero, that they have over time created this kind of collection of research studies to benefit, you know, the community and future generations. Another way in which we believe community-based research impacts, you know, those involved is that it creates ever-expanding networks of care and support. So, for example, everyone involved in the research project, you know, one of our Indonesian mothers put it very well. She said, we immigrated to this country, we didn't know anything about the education system, and we were we felt very isolated and we didn't know what to do. But now that we're part of the CARE initiative, not only do we have support to help younger children navigate and demystify education and gain access to college and beyond, but we know so many people who are school leaders, who are education professors, who are community activists. We know so many other young people who are first-generation college students, and we all support each other. And that ever-expanding network of care and support is not to be underestimated. It's very powerful. And from our work, there's been new projects that have been spawned. So young people, for example, who were in our project, once they got into college, they created new college access initiatives with new colleagues that they've met. In addition to that, doctoral students who have been involved in our project, you know, doctoral students, for example, such as Erica, when they've gone on to universities, they've created new community-based partnerships, right? So there's this kind of a ripple effect of the impact. And finally, one of the things we would say is that the work really contributes to broader social movements for social justice. And we see this in the work that we started with as Jasmine and Owen, who have become very involved in not only education rights, but also housing justice and issues and intersectional issues surrounding, you know, community gentrification and displacement, and the importance of fortifying and nourishing and protecting our communities. So when we make an argument for the impact of this work, we really try to do it, you know, in this kind of multifaceted way. So finally, and I mentioned this a little bit in the video, that when we think at heart what drives our research, the North Star is really a practice of love, right? That what does it mean to reconceptualize research methodology as a practice of love? Because we believe love is one of the only things that can really break down and challenge extractivist approaches to research that really objectify others. And I think about the philosopher Martin Buber, who kind of talks about I-thou relationships instead of I-it relationships, right? How do we cultivate I-thou relationships, reciprocal relationships in research, rather than viewing the participants in our studies as merely objects to be theorized, rather than subjects themselves, subjects who are intellectuals, subjects who are desiring, subjects who have emotions and feelings, right? But as we talked about in the film, this requires a very specific definition of love, right? And this is where we're very indebted to so many social movements, such as the civil rights movement with Dr. King, or we think about Gandhi, all of which had elements, all of which foregrounded love in those social movements. But it wasn't a love that excluded, right? For example, love of the same, love of neighbor, love of country can be very exclusive, because if you're not a neighbor, if you're not part of the nation, if you're not part of the same tribe, right, then love can become weaponized to oppress others. But we're talking about a love that really embraces multiplicity, one that has a type of radical hospitality and inclusivity to it. And love that is also a practice, right? And this is, we're indebted to thinkers such as Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire in the fields of education, who talk about love and pedagogy and love as a practice of liberation, where, you know, we don't homogenize each other and look at each other as the same, but we realize that we are interdependent, that we're, you know, all part of this, you know, ultimately the same ship, right? That people are navigating different degrees of, but navigating a certain sense of precarity. And what is the love that's required to create these trusting and relational bonds in research, and to think about research as a vehicle for both emancipation and to make the world a better place. So, you know, I think there's a lot more to be said about this and to be thought about this, but we think we found it very empowering ourselves to have love as a North Star as we try to conceptualize research methodology.
Just this last one.
And finally, you know, we just kind of want to leave on this note, because we know that a lot of you in the audience are very affiliated with universities. And we believe that some of the most significant research oriented towards justice involves collective, long-term epistemic cooperation that values multiple ways of knowing. And that so many of us as university students, as university professors and teachers, we might play an important role in helping create conditions to advance the epistemic rights of people, especially people who are non-elites, right? Their right to know and take action on creating a better society and world for both themselves, but for all of us. So with that being said, thank you very much. And we are done with our presentation, and we look forward to any dialogue or hearing your thoughts or questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. ¿Sí me escuchan? Sí. Bueno.
We're having a little trouble hearing.
No, I think we're good.
Oh, we're good?
She
Okay.
was figuring that out.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias por la conferencia. Estamos aquí reunidos algunos profesores de la maestría en estudios en literatura, pero veo que ya también hay manos levantadas. Entonces, si quieren, le damos la palabra a Marisol Luna, luego al doctor Fernando Riveros, y luego vemos aquí tenemos intervenciones, ¿sí? Marisol.
Muchas gracias, Mayra. Thank you, Maria Paula and Gerald. And really, my heart is still beating. I love your presentation because I think we need to be more emotional with the research. I have some comments and one question. Some colleagues and me, we already conducted a survey of young people away from an adult-centric view, because we thinking it's very important start to ask the young people what we need to know about them, no? And we start with a focus group, and we found there's something very, very interesting in the focus group, because the young people is the different context. Young people with in situation with poverty and violence, and young people with study the high school. So we found a very, very interesting things. The common problem they thinking we ask is about the violence, how we can the violence, I think so they thinking is a very, very bad problem. So one young people is very, very worried about the emotional situation, about how they're feeling, but another the young people in situation the poverty, they're worried about how they can work and get money, you know. So it's very, very emotional what we're doing. But my question is, do you have any examples about projects when it's the topic is the violence? Because we realize it's not enough just get the data or get the information. I think we realize we need to start to do community activities with these people, because they want to do something. They're worried. They want to change their own communities. So that, I don't know, I'm explaining myself, but thank you, really, really, I love it, and love your methodology, and really like to hear what do you think.
You want to start or? Okay. Thank you, Marisol. That was amazing, and a wonderful example. And you know, I think what comes to mind to me is the shift, right? That we have to start by asking young people what they're thinking and what's at the forefront of their minds. And you know, for us as educators and as researchers, sometimes that's really outside our comfort zone, and it's also outside our area of expertise, right? So, you know, I have colleagues who do work on gun violence in the United States, but that's not my own area. And I think we've encountered similar instances where, you know, what youth and families are interested in investigating, or what they're worried about or want to change, is really not our own area. And it's really decentered us to say, okay, what are the resources that we need to look at together? Who else knows about this and is doing, is working for change? What kinds of programs exist in the community? How can school curriculum be connected to these other systemic problems? And so it's really not, once you find these things out, it shifts how you're conceptualizing of the problem and how you're thinking about students, because you might see, you know, a kind of disengagement in school, and you realize it's due for other reasons, right? Or you might be able to craft school curricula in a way that attends to these topics that are people are interested in, but then you know that education alone isn't the answer, and that we need to work with others to maybe, as you mentioned, do different community programs, or think about what have been the impacts of violence, and how can we leverage a movement to try to make systemic change. You know, we've learned a lot from the community organizers that we've worked with about not just the programming we can create, but who do we need to talk to? What kind of public forums do we need to connect to so that we can make some kind of change?
And I just might add, thank you for that. I want to echo what Maria said about how powerful it is to ask the young people themselves, right? Because I think a lot of community-based research, I mean, too often we have the values and we pursue the questions that are formulated by those in power, right? And I think community-based research is really about allowing, you know, those who often do not have the power to ask the questions and to convey what their values are with respect to different social situations. And we don't know the context that you're speaking in, you know it better than we do, obviously. But Philadelphia also grapples with a tremendous amount of violence. In fact, recently, just a few blocks from our house where Maria Paula and I live, there was a mass shooting, another one, you know. And so Philadelphia has a tremendous amount of gun violence. And the one thing I would say, based on our own work, is just at a very basic level, how important it is to bring families and young people together to talk about it, you know, and to know that there's a larger community that they have to navigate these issues. So I'll just give you one very quick example. When we first moved back to Philadelphia, there was a very big kind of bullying incident, right? Where that really pitted two communities against each other, the Asian American immigrant community and the African American community. But what's been really powerful over the years is that there's a lot of solidarity that has developed across these communities, in large part because different grassroots organizations have come together. So now, for example, we talked about at the beginning of our project, when an affordable housing unit was being demolished that served predominantly the African American community of West Philadelphia, many Asian American community members showed up to support them. And reciprocally, when Chinatown was, you know, when there were actions to protect Chinatown, many people from that housing project and other people within the African American community showed up. So it's not enough, you know, but just to know that for young people to know that they're not so isolated, that they have a group that can come together and at least discuss these issues and think through them together and try to take some steps together is not to be underestimated. It's a powerful first step.
Thank you so much. Again, really enjoyed your conference.
Thank you, Marisol, and we look forward to hearing more about your research and the work with the youth that you're doing as it develops.
Yes. We keep in touch.
Great.
Doctor Fernando.
Gracias. Pues primero que nada, saludar con afecto y con mucho gusto a María Paula, a Gerald. Un gusto verlos y escucharlos. Coco, yo creo que ahora le traduces a Gerald para hablar en español, por favor. Estaba escuchándolos y veo que su trabajo ya lo sabía, pero lo constato una vez más en el campo de la liberación del pensamiento y de la educación como herramienta liberadora de las comunidades. Esa idea de invitar a los padres de familia o a las familias a convertirse en investigadores, pues los ayuda a comprender la situación en la que se encuentran, analizarla y cómo salir de la misma, ¿no? Cómo emprender acciones comunitarias y familiares para salir de esa situación. me gusta decirle a los alumnos de la prepa que ninguno de los derechos que actualmente tenemos son inamovibles, que siempre están en riesgo: el derecho a la educación, el derecho al trabajo, el derecho a la seguridad, porque la política y los políticos traen sus ideas y traen sus intereses. Tuvimos un tiempo a un grupo de políticos que querían reproducir el esquema norteamericano, donde toda la educación cueste, donde toda la salud cueste, tenga un costo. Actualmente es otro tipo de política que también tiene sus muchas sombras, ¿no? Pero si no son nuestros chicos conscientes de lo que pueden perder, no van a nunca luchar por mantener sus ganancias, como es el derecho a una educación pública, gratuita. Entonces yo creo que es muy importante esa tarea que ustedes realizan. Más que una pregunta, quiero resaltar esto que comprendí y felicitarlos por esa labor que cotidianamente realizan en la investigación, en el compromiso con todas estas comunidades a las que apoyan. Nos dan ejemplo de cómo caminar también con nuestras comunidades. Yo me comprometo a hacer algo con los padres de familia aquí nosotros los invitamos a cursos de padres de familia. Pero me gusta la idea de involucrarlos en el tema de la investigación. ¿Por qué estamos teniendo los problemas sociales que tenemos o los problemas de comportamiento que tenemos con sus hijos? ¿Qué hace falta que hagamos como comunidad? Porque luego en las escuelas somos depositarios, somos guarderías de los muchachos y la familia se desentiende diciendo, pues a ustedes les toca educarlos, cuando debemos de ser una red. Ustedes manejan mucho el concepto de red social. Y eso es lo que tenemos que reforzar, nuestras redes de seguridad, nuestras redes de conocimiento, nuestras redes de convivencia, para poder salir adelante como comunidad. Entonces, pues bueno, solamente quería hacer esta reflexión a partir de lo que escuché y de lo que conozco de su trabajo, y tener la oportunidad de saludarlos. Muchas gracias. Y felicidades a la maestría por organizar este tipo de encuentros.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for those really astute and wonderful comments. I just have a little bit response to Dr. Fernando, what you brought up. So one of the things I think is really important is that we did involve parents, right? There is a tradition in the United States and elsewhere of something called youth participatory action research. And that often involves university people working kind of exclusively and predominantly with youth. But we thought that's a little bit of a problem in education, because education has a long history in the United States of separating youth from their families. So if we think back to boarding schools for Native Americans, right, where Native Americans were separated from their parents and forced to assimilate, often violently, very violently, to mainstream American society. Or if we even just think about, the border, where a lot of children were detained, and separated from their parents. But it happens in more subtle ways in the education system, where often the school system communicates to young people in subtle ways and sometimes obvious ways that there's something wrong with their families or their communities. So for us, it was very important for our work to be intergenerational, to involve everything from young children to all the way up to what we call the elders. And I feel like that's made the project more kind of trusting and sustainable over the years. I also love what you talked about in terms of rights. And I would love to hear eventually, more about what's going on in Mexico. I think in the United States, I was just reading a book that we have a long history of kind of like negative rights, right? So the right not to be interfered with from the government in terms of, you know, our property or maybe our freedom of speech. But we haven't, there could have been a tradition of more positive rights. And there were moments in American history that really reflected like positive rights that really enable people to flourish. The right to healthcare, the right to an education, you know, the right to work, the right to mobility, all these kind of things. But unfortunately, you know, we haven't necessarily chosen that path, you know, in the United States. But this idea of epistemic rights and the right to research, we really think about that as a way to support, no matter what happens and no matter what politicians do, it's one way that we as university people can support families and community members in exercising, you know, self-determination, both individual and collective self-determination. Because you can't take action in the world unless you know about, you know, what you want to take action on. And you know, so that's where I think that piece of epistemic rights come in. And I know the world has so many problems, but I feel like that's one small lane where hopefully we in the university can kind of contribute, you know, to the betterment of society. Anyway, I could go on and on. Your question and your comments raised so many thoughts for me. So thank you so much, Fernando.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Gerald. Gracias, María Paula.
Bueno, le voy a hacer el uso de la hoja al maestro Arturo, que está aquí con nosotros y nos pidió.
Buenos días, felicidades por el trabajo que realizan. Como siempre, grato escucharlos y no deja de sorprenderme a mí las líneas por las que trabajan. Nada más quisiera hacer dos comentarios. Hay varias cosas que me llamaron la atención, por ejemplo, este asunto del trabajo con la iglesia, pero quisiera nada más comentarles dos cosas. Esto de que hablan de ustedes del paisaje de los activistas o de quienes conforman el entorno, porque creo que nosotros en no pocas ocasiones desconocemos el entorno en el que estamos situados, no tenemos el paisaje del que se habla, qué grupos componen, quiénes están en nuestro entorno, y entonces no podemos hacer las intervenciones pertinentes. Por otro lado, yo quisiera comentarles de un texto de Leonardo Boff, un sacerdote católico brasileño, a quien por cierto el Papa, el anterior, ¿cómo se llama? No, el otro. Bueno, Juan Pablo II le puso votos de silencio, él no se dejó y siguió hablando. Iba a venir a nuestra ciudad, pero dijeron que era muy peligroso venir a Guadalajara. Bueno, el caso es que él tiene un pequeño texto que se llama El mito de cuidado. A propósito de este asunto que ustedes hablan al final, del asunto del amor. En este mito de cuidado, hace referencia a varias cosas, desde luego el mito de cuidado, pero el asunto está en que en este juego, en que ¿qué surge primero? ¿El cuidado o el amor? ¿El amor o el cuidado? Y yo creo que es muy importante una reflexión para los estudiantes, para los profesores, el que nosotros tenemos que amar a los estudiantes, y en ese mismo sentido tenemos que cuidar a los estudiantes, que tenemos que cuidar la infraestructura, que tenemos que amarla, que tenemos que cuidar nuestro barrio, que tenemos que amar nuestro barrio, que tenemos que cuidar a nuestros padres, que tenemos que amar a nuestros padres, etcétera. Y yo creo que es un eje principalísimo, al menos Yo lo veo en mis experiencias con los alumnos, que necesitamos este amor y este cuidado para arraigarnos con el otro, para conocer al otro, para lograr identificarnos con el otro, poder cuidarlo y poder amarlo. Yo creo que este es un eje muy importante que se olvida y tratamos a la persona como si no fuera un sujeto, sino como si fuera, digamos, un código o alguien más en la lista, etcétera, y no tenemos el tiempo suficiente para cuidarlo y para que él se sienta amado. De nueva cuenta los felicito y me parece que este eje que apuntan al final del amor es muy importante. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for those comments and, excuse me, that recommendation. We will definitely read up on that, and I think there's a lot of resonances. Excuse me.
Yeah, I can't wait to check out that book, and there's several things you said. Number one, it is really important. It was important for us before we began any kind of research to get a little bit of a sense of the activist landscape of the city. What were the community groups? What were the leaders? Who was already kind of doing this work, right? And we've always seen our work as just one node in this larger kind of like constellation of things that have been going on, but I think it's absolutely important to kind of decenter oneself, especially, when you come from the arrogance of the academy, to learn about what else is going on there. And I really look forward to this book, The Myth of Care, and just learning more about how other people kind of theorize both love and care practices. I think one thing, when you were talking, I thought about another thinker who's really influenced our work, and it's a Caribbean social theorist, Edward Ghiso, who talks about the right to opacity, right? So a lot of our work isn't about, with our partners, with the families we work with, we always want to give them the right to opacity. We're not trying to know them in any definitive way. We're not trying to know them psychologically, completely, or do a social final reading of them. Because there's a long, kind of colonial history of knowing people and sorting them and classifying them. So we agree with this kind of like fundamental right to opacity. I mean, we're all probably as individuals even opaque to ourselves, much less kind of definitively knowing others. But at the same time, I feel like the emotion of love makes the boundary between individuals more porous. And another person's interest, another person's desire, another person's affect or emotions affects us. And that's one of the things that I think is really true about the work that we're doing in South Philadelphia, is, I mean, one of the things that Maria and I were just talking about, that what keeps us up all night, is that if we did a different kind of research, if we just interviewed people and then left and analyzed the interviews and coded the interviews or whatever, at some level that would be so much easier. But because we have an approach to research that's very relational, we're actually, and we've kind of cultivated, we think, this trust. It's imperfect, as all human relationships are imperfect, but we've cultivated this trust over years. We really worry about betraying the community and betraying that trust, So we're always kind of thinking about that, and that does require these kind of constant attention to what we do and being caring about how we approach things. So I'm very excited to check out. If someone could write in the chat, I have Leonardo is the first name, but if someone could write in the chat the last name of the thinker who wrote The Myth of Care, that would be fantastic.
Sí.
Ok, ahorita escribimos el chat. Le voy a pasar el uso de la voz a la doctora Patti.
Hola, Pati.
Hola, hola, qué gusto saludarles. Es una alegría muy grande para nosotros volvernos a encontrar con estos dos extraordinarios académicos, amigos muy queridos que, bueno, nos comparten, nos han compartido desde la creación misma de la maestría y del seminario, todo este conocimiento del trabajo tan exhaustivo y tan impactante que han venido desarrollando allá con sus comunidades. Yo tengo pues quisiera hacer 3 preguntas que me surgen. Por un lado, porque observo unos paralelismos entre estas normas de la investigación que ustedes determinaron para estas comunidades. Nosotros acá, si recuerdan, la comunidad de la Prepa 14, por ejemplo, hizo su manifiesto. Aquí está Fernando Riveros, que le tocó ver cómo lo construimos allá en Chapala con este grupo de profesores de la Prepa 14. Y desde luego son planteamientos distintos, pero a mí me llama mucho la atención que estas normas tienen que ver, o sea, primero que se plantean como normas, acá nosotros lo planteábamos como un manifiesto, pero estas normas tienen que ver con la equidad como un punto de partida, con que los enfoques de investigación se codiseñan, etcétera. Y la pregunta que me surge es, ustedes cuando plantearon estas normas, ¿cómo lo hicieron y por qué? ¿Y cómo distinguen estas normas de un manifiesto? ¿No? Y bueno, esa es una de las preguntas. La otra pregunta es en cuanto a los derechos epistémicos. Me encanta esta concepción que ustedes plantean de los derechos epistémicos, y a mí me gustaría ver si profundizan un poco sobre en la práctica cómo se traducen estos derechos y cómo desde una comunidad de investigación naciente podríamos identificar que, bueno, hay ciertos sesgos, ¿no? Y que a lo mejor, ¿cómo podemos ser exhaustivos en que se conozca un territorio del conocimiento y tengamos esa claridad de desde qué epistemología estamos hablando? ¿No? Y eso me lleva a la tercera pregunta, porque yo les he escuchado hablar sobre esta teoría de la agencia, que yo la escuché o la conocí desde las políticas públicas como parte de la racionalidad económica, ¿no? Y bueno, estos teóricos del neoinstitucionalismo como Douglas North, Mancur Olsen, hacen estos planteamientos de que es muy importante la agencia de los individuos que son partícipes, a final de cuentas, de la política pública, y que es muy importante cómo ellos tienen ciertos incentivos que les da la organización social, el Estado mismo, para involucrarse o no en la participación social. Entonces veo que ustedes ya cuando hablan de la teoría de la agencia van más allá de los incentivos en este sentido estricto de racionalidad económica, que desde luego tiene sus defectos y seguramente ustedes ya le dieron la vuelta. Me gustaría que profundizaran un poquito sobre esto.
Thank you, Patti, and it's wonderful to be in dialogue with you, and great to learn from all of you as well. So I was taking some notes, and I think I'll start with question 1 about the manifesto by Prepa 14 and the connections with the norms. And I think I saw some folks from Prepa 14. Great to see you. And it's been wonderful to learn alongside you over the years. I would say there's a lot of resonance, right? And I think for us, that's something we've learned. The language of manifesto, the language of rights was not necessarily something that we came in with, but something that we learned through the partnership and through what our community partners were sharing with us as we learned, as they were involved in this activist panorama that was discussed in the previous question. So I think for us, in terms of norms, we were thinking about what types of practices, how do we theorize our own practice of partnering? And that comes for us from our traditions of practitioner research and thinking about our own practices, that the work that we're doing is not only the end goal or the content, the knowledge that's generated, but how that is enacted through collaborative practices. And so those pedagogical moves or stances, you can say in the abstract, research should benefit the community. And we were wondering about how to do that specifically, right? And so I think there's a lot of resonances, and probably if we were to decide on other kinds of norms or how will we work together, I think that you see some of the activist language, like the manifesto that was in Prepa 14, in the educational demands and in the ways that those particular norms have been taken up within our own partnership. So I think it's been a little bit of an evolution for us. Exactly what to call it has really been the learning from others that we've partnered alongside. And I think another resonance with the work of Prepa 14 and their manifesto is thinking about valuing the work of local knowledge and teachers and local folks as knowledge generators, right? And thinking that educational practice, while it may be about a particular educational objective or something that you're trying, has these broader goals of inclusion, of connection to other rights that are not just, whatever the curriculum might be. And so I think that was something that the teachers and leaders of Prepa 14 really took up, and that we are really in alignment with. And there's a lot of synergy there. Gerald, do you want to talk a little bit about the
Yeah. Sorry, I love your question about agency, and I think I have so much to learn from you, Pati, around that. I mean, one of the things that just came to my mind is really kind of like a dominant notion of agency that probably arose with like the neoliberal humanist subject, which really views individuals as almost atomically, as like individual atoms who act rationally, in their own self-interest for either kind of economic or material betterment, And I feel like that notion of agency in many ways has perpetuated, at least in the United States, in education, all sorts of ideologies, like the ideology of meritocracy, that, like life is kind of a competition, and those with the most talent and who work the hardest, will be rewarded. And other people who aren't as successful, well, really, it's their fault, right, in a way. But I think we do need to think about other forms of agency. For example, agency as cooperation or collective forms of agency, or what does it mean to kind of value, a multiplicity of knowledges and perspective towards a kind of shared goals. Because, as we talked about so much before, we can't think so individualistically anymore. I mean, the problems that we're grappling, we're all in this together. Like, I mean, the most obvious example in my mind comes, in terms of climate change. We've had like the hottest summer, like historical memory here in the United States, and Mexico, I hear as well, in the Northeast. And if everyone just continues, to act as individual agents in terms of, their own self-fulfillment or material gain, we're all going to go down in this ship together, So for a while, those with more privilege may stave off the impact. But ultimately, I love what you're saying. I mean, we have to kind of think about, agency in terms of ways that value notions of interdependence, that value notions of epistemic cooperation, that value, a multiplicity of perspectives, so we can really work together no matter where we're located, no matter our social or institutional social location, to solve these kind of really systemic problems of which we're all implicated in. So I don't know if I have an adequate answer to that, but I really love the question itself, and I think it gives us a lot to think about.
And maybe I'll just say, just for a minute, talk to question 2, which you were talking about epistemic rights and both how that's concretized in practice, and I think the idea of the biases that we might bring. And there's a paradox there, right? In terms of we want to honor knowledge, but also that we all have biases and lenses that color our own perspectives, right? And so I think that's important in terms of the practices of collaborative inquiry, and that's some of the things that we're thinking about now. It's not that you necessarily have knowledge by virtue of a certain identity or position, but that you are kind of positioned to inquire into these ideas, which may mean contending with your own biases or thinking about the shortcomings of what you know or don't know. And I think that idea of love is really central there, and care, because I think when relationships are formed, we are better able to talk through things that might be divisive or differences of opinion, and to hear each other's stories in different ways, and all of us to learn and grow in our understandings. And so, for example, one divisive issue, police violence is one issue. Another, there's so many mass shootings, and when our youth and families were thinking about what schools look like, right? And thinking about violence, we had various things that were both at the same time true and also kind of competing with one another. Youth who were experiencing a lot of gun violence and were looking at metal detectors and saying, like, we need more drills so that if anybody comes in with a gun, they can be stopped. And then at the same time, a mother who was saying, these schools look like prisons because children have to walk through a metal detector to come in, and was also saying, not all the schools, not all youth are treated like that, right? And so what is the racial disparity in which schools look like prisons and which students are treated like criminals, and what's the best context for learning? But she, as they were trying to figure out, do we want more metal detectors or more security measures or less, both of those feelings were true in how the youth were experiencing it, and other youth, and also the families' perspective and the activist perspective to fight against kind of schools becoming prisons. And I think they were really able to sit and talk through some of those differences of opinion because of the care that they had developed for one another over time. And so part of that is, we can say very abstractly, everyone has the right to research. What happens when these, we can have multiple perspectives and they really inform each other, but it's not romanticized in the moment, right? And so what is that collaborative inquiry? What does it look like? And how can we foster, really generative conversations and discussions and actions to make a difference?
And Pati, I just might add, this is a real gift you have is to bring people together from different social locations and geographical locations, and to kind of really think through issues and problems together. It's kind of like Susan Slidell's notion of a community of inquiry. right? Because there is no Archimedean point that any of us have from which we kind of like view the social world in a neutral and, you know, all-knowing manner. And it's also why I invoked this term earlier. I got it from the philosopher Jose Medina, but this idea of relational epistemic humility, I think is, you know, and so in research, there's always a degree of epistemic humility or fallibilism, right? Where, you know, we're part of trying to understand the world more and we get new evidence and we revise our interpretation based on the evidence we get. But historically, it's still thought of as very much an individual process, you know, by individual researchers. But this notion of relational epistemic humility means we just really need to take seriously, you know, which doesn't mean we suspend our own views or, you know, or that we become relativists, but just that we really need to take seriously the perspective of others and incorporate those viewpoints as we collectively try to work through and solve problems together. And I think that's a form of agency, like a collective form of agency, if we can genuinely learn how to do that.
Gracias. Bueno, sería ya una última intervención de parte de la doctora Marta Vergara, que también se encuentra con nosotros, entonces le voy a pasar el uso de la voz.
Hola, hola, buen día. Bueno, pues en primer lugar un agradecimiento por compartirnos esta experiencia tan maravillosa, me gustó. Lo que pasa en la investigación educativa es que regularmente queremos aplicar o desarrollar investigación, pero a partir desde la metodología o la aplicación de protocolos. Lo interesante es cómo ingresan ustedes a la preparación o a la realización de la investigación en campo. Entonces el contexto, el tiempo y el espacio cobran un sentido distinto a como lo estamos o como lo vivimos regularmente en la formación de los posgrados. En los posgrados, y esto es un ejemplo importante, le doy mucho sentido para la maestría, porque en los posgrados queremos que los estudiantes planteen el problema, utilicen una teoría, de igual manera un planteamiento de hipótesis y demás, y el campo se deja al final y se alcanza. Entonces, me gusta la investigación, bueno, las experiencias que ustedes están planteando, porque entonces los sujetos participantes, en este caso los sujetos de la investigación, no se limita su papel a ser solamente consultados para que contesten la información que nosotros los investigadores requerimos, sino que su papel es un papel activo. Y este papel no solamente pienso que nos va a aportar información a los investigadores, sino que este papel es el papel que les otorga o que les proporciona. A partir de la democratización del conocimiento, las personas aprenden, se forman, pueden revivir o tener un papel diferente o activo. Por eso es que ustedes han logrado que hayan avanzado hasta llegar a la universidad. Entonces, en ese sentido me surgen algunas preguntas que quisiera, si es posible, por el curso que estoy dando ahora en la maestría, que es un curso que esta charla se apega al 100, al curso que estoy dando. Entonces, en ese sentido, observo que hay una distancia muy clara y que debe haber entre el sujeto y el objeto, donde el sujeto, que es participante en la investigación, ya no es solamente el objeto, sino tiene vivencia, tiene experiencias, tiene vida. Y el investigador igual, tiene vida, es un sujeto, entonces es un sujeto que investiga con sujetos. Ahí en ese sentido, reconozco que en ese sentido, en ese encuentro de sujetos, puede haber un aprendizaje mutuo, no solamente de los sujetos investigados, sino también del sujeto que investiga. Y esto tiene que ver con la cultura de cómo fuimos formados los investigadores, de que regularmente los investigadores solamente investigamos a nosotros para cobrar o para recabar información. Entonces, en este sentido, quisiera yo consultarles a ustedes ¿Cómo han podido lograr esa democratización del conocimiento en ese proceso que investigativamente se debe conservar el papel del sujeto investigador y del sujeto investigado? O sea, epistemológicamente tiene que cuidarse, no es el mismo. ¿Cómo han logrado ustedes ese cuidado, pero luego cómo han transitado a la democratización del conocimiento? Esa es una. Otra pregunta es, me queda claro que con este ejercicio que ustedes nos presentaron, pues es una investigación participativa, una investigación acción participativa, es claro, por los procesos y el propósito que ustedes nos ejemplifican. En este sentido, también me queda claro que en el proceso de la investigación-acción y la investigación participativa, las comunidades, los grupos, los participantes, son los que definen el qué y cómo investigar. Entonces me gustaría saber cómo le han hecho ustedes. Porque nosotros, desde la cultura de la investigación, nosotros fabricamos, construimos el tema y el problema y luego nos vamos allá y allá los involucramos, hacemos una labor de convencimiento y los queremos que ellos se involucren y cambiar la mentalidad. Creo que desde que ustedes lo participaron es al revés. Entonces, ¿cómo lo han hecho? Y tercera pregunta, veo con mucha claridad la aplicación de una justicia epistémica y lo veo con mucha claridad aquí. Entonces, en este sentido, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque a partir de sus investigaciones, se recupera o se fomenta la oportunidad del acceso a la educación, en la distribución de los recursos, en el trabajo en comunidad, lo veo claro. En ese sentido, quisiera consultarles como investigadores cómo lo logran, o sea, cómo lo han hecho metodológicamente, cómo. Y bueno, esto tiene que ver con mi experiencia, o sea, mi expertise es en metodología y tengo una gran trayectoria en eso, pero ahora estoy tratando de cambiar desde otra visión para trabajar en la investigación. Entonces me gustaría esta parte. Y también yo creo que esta conferencia la vamos a utilizar en mi clase como base, porque me parece que es importante. Y felicidades y agradecerles su generosidad por compartir con nosotros en este espacio. Muchas gracias. María.
Thank you. Gracias, Doctora Marta. That was, I think you really captured that dilemma, right? Of especially when in universities are organized around having protocols prior to that. Here in the US, where we have to get clearances, we almost have to have certain things delineated. And that is in direct tension with the methodologies that we're advocating for. And so I think, well, two things. One is that I think that, you don't necessarily have to give up the researcher role. It is just more of thinking about who's constructing the questions and how do you characterize the research, whose priorities are being served. And it is, I think we've also heard back from some of our community partners, well, don't you know this? Or when we've tried to take too much of a step back to say, you have certain skills to contribute here. So it's not about diminishing that role only and saying it's all about the community. It is a dialogue and partnership, right? And so some of the research questions, have been community priorities that they have wanted us to take more of a lead in. Right. And so it is still dialogic, it's still co-constructed, but, they might have wanted to do more traditional surveys or interviews because, community members have argued that a survey would give us important data that we can bring to the school board meetings to say, this is not just my story. This is a big issue in the community and I have the data to prove it, right? And so it is, and at other times they have been other kinds of participatory arrangements and kind of qualitative inquiries. And so I think that it is about not determining everything beforehand and having a hypothesis, although community members have their own hypotheses, right? So we might have a collective hypothesis. Then figuring out how do we change the ways of talking about research in universities, in conferences, in publications, so that we are redefining what these methods look like and what those protocols are. And so some of that, we're saying it's not that we don't have a protocol, it's that arriving at the protocol comes from different directions, takes a longer time, has different facets. And I think it's involved a lot of dialogue at the university level and with other professional organizations, but at least in our field, it's the direction that research is taking. And so we're very happy that I think there's an audience for this and there's an urgency for this, and people have been very receptive to it.
Yeah, and I can add on, Martha, I love your questions because they were very precise. And we don't have our head completely wrapped around what we're doing. It feels very messy sometimes. It doesn't feel very linear, right? Because it is very relational and it is a very living thing. So it's not like the researcher has, as me as a university researcher, has delineated a linear plan that now I'm just going into the community and executing, right? But there are different ways that we have tried to use kind of different metaphors or different ways to think about the research. So for example, one thing we often say is that the research involves a creative alchemy, right? So for example, a doctoral student may go into our research site and that doctoral student may have particular interests and passions around, let's say, I'm thinking about actual doctoral students, around the role that Graphica and comics can play in student learning, around the idea of creating a girls of color writing community from a feminist perspective, around thinking about how we can reconceive civic engagement. But at the same time, the community members come into the project with their own passions, their own interests, their own questions. And often it's in the creative alchemy between the two that different kind of possibilities arise, right? I think about Deleuze's concept of the rhizome, that there's many different ways that people have kind of like entered the project and entered the space and done kind of innovative and creative things. Or I even think about like Gadamer's notion of a fusion of horizons. So it's not like me as a researcher, I have my own intellectual horizons. There's things I've studied. There's questions I've been passionate about. There's things that I know or have been exposed to. So I don't come in as a blank slate. I come with this kind of like interpretive kind of cultural historical horizon, but so do the community members, right? And there's a kind of fusion that happens that creates new areas of inquiry, new possibilities. And also I would say it's messy because often there are a lot of things going at the same time. We may have a very, for example, traditional action research project going on. So I remember once where the elders, the parents, did action research on the high school admissions process. Because in Philadelphia, not all the students just go to their neighborhood high school, they actually have to apply to different high schools. But it's a bureaucratically very convoluted thing to do. So our parents wanted to know, like, how should we think about applying our children to high school? What's involved in that? And they did action research around it. But at the same time, a young person may have been doing research into, the conditions of teaching and learning in their schools. And we were kind of at the same time researching what does it mean to have an equitable partnership with families. So it is messy. A lot of things are going on at the same time. And, you know, we're still trying to develop a vocabulary or language to describe it. And your very precise questions are exactly the ones that we need to think about and you know, internalize and try to answer, you know, as lucidly as possible, because we do feel like it is a different kind of paradigm of research. It involves long-term collective epistemic cooperation, you know, between, you know, universities and communities and schools and families.
And I would just add one last thing there too, which is sometimes these horizons don't align, right? Sometimes the alchemy isn't there and a project doesn't move forward. You know, if we were, at one time we were partnering with the school associated with the church, but then the principal that came in wanted us to do more things around training the teachers for assessments, right? That wasn't our area nor our commitments, and we ended up doing things for the youth and teachers that were outside of the official school space. Then new leadership comes in and there's possibilities for reinvention. So I think that you know, that you are always negotiating these the focus of the research, the questions, the protocols, and then sometimes those come to fruition because there can be a negotiation, and sometimes there's just too much difference and you have to put your energy in other places.
Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Creo que ya nada más serían los comentarios que están en el chat, ¿no? Que bueno, Irma nos dice que le resulta extraordinario su trabajo, pues precisamente esto es lo valioso de la literacidad, asociar conocimientos previos, cuestiones culturales, costumbres, etcétera, todo esto que crea puentes para extender nuestro conocimiento, esa es la riqueza de la investigación comunitaria. Reconozco en los doctores Campano su sentido humano, amor y compromiso con esta comunidad. Felicidades y saludos desde la Prepa 14. Y bueno, de parte del doctor Jorge Sousa, los felicita, ¿no? Lamentablemente se tuvo que salir, pero les envía un gran abrazo. Bueno, ya dejo aquí el maestro Arturo, el dato del libro, del mito del cuidado, de Leonardo Boff. Y Rita y Erika nos dicen que muchas gracias por su curiosidad y rebeldía intelectual a los doctores Campano y Ghiso. No, entonces, pues creo que ya nada más sería por nuestra parte agradecer, ¿no? Que hayan estado aquí, que hayan sido tan generosos, que se hayan quedado tanto tiempo, que nos hayan contestado todas nuestras dudas y además nos las hayan ampliado. Entonces, pues creo que de nuestra parte nada más nos queda agradecimiento hacia ustedes y no sé si ustedes tengan algo que quisieran decir antes de irnos.
I just hope to see everyone in person sooner rather than later and to continue the dialogue.
Thank you for being here, and it's wonderful to see you. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Nosotros también.
Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Y nos vemos. Gracias, Erika y Rita. Ya aprendieron la cama para saludarnos. Muchas gracias a todos. Y bueno, seguimos el próximo mes con nuestras siguientes grabaciones.